There was a lot of speculation when Behavior said they'd be giving the survivor role a brand new item to take into matches. I mean, we've always gotten event items, but those were usually just variations of items that already existed, and the ones that weren't were basically just gimmicks. That, and there was always the nagging fact that those items would disappear from the blood web when the event was over, which meant you had to hoard them if you wanted to use them in many games to come. This was fine in regards to how events and their items should work, being limited time and impossible to get at any other point, as then it just becomes unrelated to whatever event was happening at the time and just becomes a basic item you get in the blood web. But that wasn't what Behavior had planned. When they announced that survivors would be getting a new item, it didn't mean that survivors would have that item in the blood web for like a week and be unable to get it again. What it meant was that there'd be a new item in the blood web that never went away, making it a staple of the game for the future. And when people heard that, tensions started to rise. What would the new item be? What if it's overpowered? What if it breaks the game? Those are some questions that a large chunk of us were asking ourselves, and I think we've earned the right to worry about things like this. Thanks to Behavior's history of item balance, worrying what a new item might bring into the game and how it would change the meta was definitely deserved. I mean, just look at medkits for an example. Those things can practically break a match's balance like a twig if a group of survivors all bring one with some strong add-ons. Or look at toolboxes, which were so blatantly unfair at one point that they could ruin the game for the killer. Or insta-blind flashlights, which had so many problems I could probably make a whole video about them alone. The point is, items tend to be hit or miss, and knowing Behavior was going to be adding a brand new type, people started panicking. It took the PTB of the Walking Dead chapter to finally give us some news about what that item would be. Fog Vials. These items can be used as smoke bombs to limit the killer's visibility as well as hiding any auras, and severely limiting any sound effects going on at the time. It served to mainly disorient anyone nearby, almost to the level of waking up from a nap and not knowing what planet you're on. We've all been there, right? This item has already had an embarrassing history in the game, to being pretty coldly received on the PTB, to getting nerfed, to getting nerfed again. And now I almost see no one running them because, well, why would you run an item that's pretty weak when you could just run items that are much stronger? Especially now that the novelty of having a new item has died down, they're just kind of sitting in the background hoping someone pays attention to them like I do every time I'm in public. So why exactly did Fog Vials never catch on? Why did they get nerfed despite being pretty weak? Why did they get nerfed a second time for seemingly no reason? Well, join me for a bit and we'll talk about the fundamental flaws of Fog Vials. While they may have only been recently added, Fog Vials have seemingly been in development for a long time. The first time I can ever remember a version of Fog Vials being in the game was during the Haunted by Daylight event of last year, where they took the form of void crystals, which you could get from the void well during the event when depositing void energy. Yes, there was a lot of voidness going on during that time. These created a sphere of blue smoke when used, and were honestly pretty great at getting the killer to lose track of you. They were super disorienting. I mean, it took up your entire screen and made it incredibly hard for the killer to keep track of the survivor. This was especially problematic when on an indoor map, or if the survivor put a bit of distance between them and the killer, as they could then drop the crystal and probably not get hit. However, they were fun for the time being, and the idea that they'd be gone after the game mode ended made them much more tolerable than they would have been otherwise. When the event ended though, it wouldn't take long for us to get the second version of them. During the fourth iteration of 2v8, we got fog crystals, which as the name definitely implies was just a variation of the void crystals. Instead of blue fog, it was kind of gray and white, and instead of getting it through engaging with the event, you got them through searching through chests. Unfortunately, these were not as warmly received as they were the first time. The novelty was just kind of gone at that point, and it came across more annoying than anything else. Nobody likes having their screen fill up with fog and needing 20/20 vision to see anything in front of them. It just felt not very engaging. At best, the crystals would be used in funny ways to try to pull off cheeky plays, creating a high-risk, high-reward scenario, and at worst, they felt like a get-out-of-jail-free card for the survivor, which, as you can imagine, wasn't very fun. At least not for the killer. The survivor would drop a crystal, and the killer would just have to hope they managed to head in the right direction, which, thanks to the muffled audio and impaired vision, felt more RNG dependent than anything else. While it was nice to have something new to shake up the gameplay, it was clear that these items needed some refinement before being added to the game in any official capacity. Only a little bit of time after void crystals made their appearance in 2v8, we got the PTB for the Walking Dead chapter, which I'm sure you are tired of hearing about by now. However, among the two new survivors, their perks, and various killer and perk changes, there was another big addition coming to the game: Fog Vials. This was the new item that Behavior had been teasing for a while now, to the surprise of maybe a few people. I think a large group of us heard Behavior was planning on adding a new base item for the survivors, and our minds instantly thought about the smoke bombs that Behavior had been trying to make work for a while at that point. Hell, there's a comment I made on my video about breakable walls where I talk about this exact thing, showing I probably wasn't the only one with this line of thinking. It just made sense that this is what Behavior would go for, but it didn't take long for people to start having problems with Fog Vials. In fact, it happened almost immediately. The glaring issue with Fog Vials, and also the conclusion I came to in my video covering the PTB, was that Fog Vials were mostly useless on their own, as they didn't do a lot to prevent the killer from being able to track the survivors through the massive cloud of fog. But if the survivors were running the potent extract add-on, the visceral one, all of a sudden they were absolutely busted, and made it almost impossible to track someone's movements through the cloud. It was almost to the level of the crystals from the previous iterations. Without that add-on though, they weren't very impressive. While the lack of scratch marks and auras could be useful, it was rare that you'd get a lot of value out of them. If you're using them to hide scratch marks, you're probably close enough to the killer that they can just track your movements like normal. If you're using them to hide auras, the killer can probably tell you're there anyway by the massive cloud of fog shining in the sky like the bat signal. Needless to say, people weren't super happy with how Fog Vials were added. If you brought the right add-ons and happened to get the right map, they were really annoying to face, amplified by the fact that they had infinite charges. This meant if they were going to be a problem, they were going to be a big problem. On the other end, if you brought a Fog Vial into a match and just raw dogged it, you'd get almost no value most of the time. This made them incredibly divisive to most people. You had one group of people that thought they were super weak, and another group of people that thought they were busted and absolutely ruined the game. Not at all helped by the fact that the clouds of fog stacked, meaning that if anyone was going to get value out of them, it was a Swift team who was going to spend all match goofing around and trying to get the killer to rage quit. So yeah, Fog Vials were not nearly as warmly received as Behavior had probably hoped, which definitely added onto the shitstorm that the rest of the Walking Dead chapter had turned into. It was clear that Fog Vials needed some more time in the oven due to how they didn't seem to be consistent whatsoever, and the downright pathetic 5 add-ons that they shipped with, which severely limited creativity on the player end. But again, it was the PTB. Maybe Behavior would be able to fix it before it went live. When the chapter actually dropped, Fog Vials did too, receiving some pretty impactful changes to how the item works. Some of these changes included removing the muffled audio when inside the cloud, adding the ability for survivors inside the cloud to make no noise, the removal of fog stacking when multiple survivors used one, getting rid of that survive with friends problem I talked about before, and some changes to the cloud's opacity and size. In addition to all those base changes, the potent extract add-on, the one that made Fog Vials so good, was significantly nerfed. So yeah, Fog Vials were pretty much dead on arrival when these changes dropped. The one add-on that you could use to make Fog Vials decent was straight up nuked, and the base item was made stronger in some cases, but much weaker in some others, making it very unappealing to use over the items that could make a big difference in the game. While there was the potential for getting value out of Fog Vials, it felt more like you were doing gymnastics to get there, and at that point, just run any other item. Medkits will always be strong, toolboxes always have their uses, flashlights are way more fun than Fog Vials are, and thanks to this update, keys and maps were more appealing to use. The extremely niche use that Fog Vials had, combined with the severe lack of interesting add-ons, created a perfect storm of boring design, and people were very quick to forget that Fog Vials were even added to begin with. But even so, Behavior wasn't done ruining them, assuming that they had any value to begin with. After the update was released, Behavior was quick to nerf Fog Vials again, for a reason we'll get into in a little bit. In patch 9.1.1, Fog Vials had their opacity reduced to 33% from the 40% it was buffed to, completely undoing the buff it was given for that live release. Soon after, in patch 9.1.2, it was nerfed again. This nerf made it so Fog Vials no longer had infinite charges and instead only had 2 uses, making them even more niche than they were before. You really can't make this up. At this point, who the hell is gonna run Fog Vials? They just don't really do anything. And there's much more impactful and game-changing items to bring, making them feel more like they're taking up space instead of making Dead by Daylight a more interesting experience as a whole. When people heard a new item was going to be added, I think we were all cautiously excited, if a little nervous, but now they might as well have never added them. So I bet you're wondering why an item that was considered to be pretty weak, at least by a large chunk of people, was nerfed multiple times after release. And to answer that question is to explain why Fog Vials are so flawed from a fundamental level. If I consider Fog Vials to be pretty weak at the base level, how do I explain why they got nerfed multiple times? Well, that's because Fog Vials just don't create fun interactions between the titular roles of Dead by Daylight. At the base level, Fog Vials are an accessibility nightmare. In a world where a game's accessibility is a much more prevalent talking point, Fog Vials take that conversation and wipe their ass with it. Limiting visual and audio cues is never going to go over well with people, specifically killer players who will be the victims of these items. When a vial is used, every sense you have is flooded with a bunch of shit you'd rather not be there. Unlike getting blinded by flashlights, you can't focus on hearing to track a survivor's movements while missing that visual. You just have to squint your eyes and ignore the blaring sound of the fog in your ear while trying to play the game. Like I said, most of the time, Fog Vials aren't going to be enough for the survivor to get away, but its strength really hinges on how well the person playing killer can put up with that. Sure, I might not have the biggest issues with tracking a survivor through a fog cloud, but maybe someone else will if they have problems with all of that distracting noise and blurry vision. I know accessibility issues are all over Dead by Daylight due to how the game is designed, and I really don't want to get too into that topic, at least for right now, but the point I want to make here is that it just adds onto a problem that's been a big conversation for some time now. The clown's gas, Doctor's shocks, and now Fog Vials just added into the mix. It's easy to understand why some people hate the item for that reason. However, even that isn't the only reason they've become problematic. Ignoring the glaring accessibility issues that Fog Vials have embedded into their code, there are still big problems littered throughout the design of this item. For one more problem, Fog Vials act differently depending on the map you're on. Some maps make Fog Vials feel completely useless, while some maps turn them into god-tier chase enders. I'm not talking about indoor maps either, even though those do contribute to the overall issues that Fog Vials create just by existing. No, for some reason, Fog Vials have different opacity depending on the lighting of the map. At least that's the way it feels. Dead Dog is a big example of this, as your entire screen gets flooded by white and it can be really hard to see anything 3 feet in front of you. Again, it does depend on the map, but the fact that this is even an issue drives me crazy. It doesn't seem to be as bad as it was on launch, at least from what I can tell, but why can't it just be consistent no matter what map you're on? This makes it so hard to balance, and people are going to have inconsistent opinions on how strong Fog Vials are because on one map they might be great, and on the other they might be useless. This leads to people feeling differently depending on the map in question and not getting a real representation of how good or bad the items are. This should not be an issue. Fog Vials should have consistent opacity and lighting no matter the map, and this just adds on to an already big problem, and I don't understand why Fog Vials look a certain way depending on the map you're on. I don't understand how that even happens. Taking away the accessibility issues and even the inconsistency between certain maps and their effect on Fog Vials, they're still not great additions to the game. Let's think about this for a second. What's the most use survivors will get out of Fog Vials? Escaping a chase, right? Losing the killer in the cloud of fog. That's what they're designed for. How is that fun by any means? For a killer, losing a chase might be straight up game ending depending on how important it was for them to get a hook at that point. For the survivors, they no longer get to engage with the killer and have to deal with the knowledge that they won a chase simply because they had the item, which is not healthy by any means. The novelty of it is kind of fun, but when we break it down to the bare bones level, there's nothing good happening in that interaction. A survivor uses a fog vial and they either get away or they don't. That's what will happen. At its most interesting interaction, maybe the chase gets extended a little because the killer loses track of them, only to find them later. That's at its best. At its worst, it makes the game so much less interesting and actively promotes the survivor sneaking away and hiding from the killer when the game is no longer based around that playstyle. I thought we were moving away from the hide and seek aspect, and these fog vials only make sense if you're still playing the game that way. This creates an impossible to win scenario for behavior. If fog vials are too good, they'll be unbearable to go against, but if they're too weak, like they are now, no one is going to use them in matches. If survivors want to be sneaky, they'll just throw on a perk build dedicated to that, instead of bringing an item that's so inconsistent you can't rely on it to help. And maybe that's for the best, because if it wasn't, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. Fog vials, at their core, are fundamentally flawed. They only serve to make gameplay less interesting and leave a lot to be desired from an item that could have been an interesting addition to Dead by Daylight, but now they're pretty much obsolete. I rarely see anyone bringing a vial into a match, and when I do, I don't see them getting much value from it to speak of. They're either too good to the point where the killer is getting frustrated because they feel like they can't play the game properly, or they're too bad where only people who want to goof around with an item that no one uses will take them into games. I mean, they can be fun to, slap on a build that you can use fog vials most efficiently, but if you have to use an entire build to get value out of an item, I think that speaks for itself. Right now, Fog Vials are extremely boring, and behavior's lack of care for giving them interesting interactions will keep them that way. A lame concept, a lack of add-ons, and significant accessibility issues will always make Fog Vials the black sheep of the items that survivors can bring into games. Hopefully, that changes one day, but for now, that's it for me, gamers. Have a great day.